I'm really honored to be able to speak with you about my book. I wrote this book as a memoir. It's not autobiography, so the idea is to record what I consider to be the most horrific part of the Chinese history, the history that I and my peers lived through. And I think in order to understand China, you have to understand its history, and especially its most recent history. We lived through a very difficult time. I finished elementary school in 1966 when the so-called Cultural Revolution started, when all the entire school system in China was shut down. Initially, I was pretty happy. I thought we were going to have a long vacation, but I didn't realize that the school system was shut down for as long as 10 years. So for the next 10 years, for a big country like China, 800 million people, there was no school at all. And the entire country was thrown into turmoil and chaos. Let me bring you to first the president of the country at that time in 1966. And the man standing next to Mao, and his name was Liu Shaoqi. He was actually the head of the state. He was the president of the country. And on the left-hand side, you see the front page article of the People's Daily on October 1st, 1959. That was the 10th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. He was portrayed, Liu Shaoqi was portrayed as the head of the state, side by side with Mao. So he was extremely prominent. And 7 years later, when the Cultural Revolution started, this is what happened to him. He was dragged out of his residence by Red Guards, rebels. He was abused, brutalized, and sent to prison without public knowledge, without any process whatsoever. And 3 years later, he died in prison. Nobody knew what happened to him. And that's what happened during that period of time to the head of the state. His wife was 47 years old. This was the first lady of China. Now, Mao was the party chairman, even though he was the paramount leader, and Liu Shaoqi was the president of the country. So Wang Guangmei, Liu Shaoqi's wife, was the first lady. She was dragged out by college students to be verbally abused in front of 300,000 students like this. And the necklace she wore were made of ping pong balls. The Red Guards forced her to wear the necklace, this ridiculous outfit, to humiliate her, to suggest that she had a preference for a capitalistic lifestyle. And she was put into prison right after this in solitary confinement for a total of 12 years. She survived prison and came out after the Cultural Revolution, but she didn't know that her husband died 9 years earlier. Nobody told her. And this gentleman was the first defense minister of China, and his name was Peng Dehuai. And he was one of the founding fathers of New China, and he led the Chinese armed forces in the Korean War when China fought with the United States, American troops, to a standstill at 38th parallel, which stands to this day. So he was considered to be a hero to the new People's Republic, and yet he got into trouble for criticizing Mao in 1958, because in that year, Mao launched the so-called Great Leap Forward, which is a policy to rapidly industrialize the country. And that policy led to almost immediately the Great Famine of China between 1960 and 1962. And in those 3 years, a total of 30 million people died of starvation, which represented about 5% of the entire Chinese population at the time, died of starvation. So it was total failure of policy. And for mildly criticizing Mao, Peng Dehuai was stripped of all his positions. He was exiled to the southwest part of China. And when the Cultural Revolution started in 1966, he was dragged by the rebels and Red Guards back to Beijing. He was brutalized, and eventually he also died in prison, in confinement. And couldn't quite get this thing to work. I need to go back to the previous slide. Is this the computer? No. How do you go back? Things stop to move. Ah, here. Okay. Okay. We're back. You see this person being paraded by the Red Guards on the streets with large placard. His name is on that plaque. And it says Xi Zhongxun. He was the father of Xi Jinping, the president of the country today. And Xi Zhongxun was vice premier of the country in 1963. He got into trouble for supporting the publication of a book which Mao considered to be a poisonous weed. And for that, he was purged. He was fired from his position. He was put into confinement for a total of 18 years. And he survived the Cultural Revolution. I know how risky it is to publish a book, especially in China, and just for publishing a book, and that's how much trouble he got into. But this gives you some idea of the kind of chaos and turmoil China was thrown into by Mao during that period of time. For a total of 10 years, the entire country was like this. I grew up in Beijing, and I was 12 years old when this happened. And I witnessed with my own eyes how middle school students beat up their teachers to death in the month of August alone in 1966. A total of 1,700 middle school teachers were beaten to death by their students in Beijing, just in one city, and including the one that I saw in one of the middle schools. And Mao called upon the Red Guards to spread the revolution throughout the country. And they did. They fanned out into all corners of China to spread the revolution. Anybody in the government, anybody in any establishment, any authority figures in the establishment, whether in the government or in academic circles, were targets by the Red Guards. So China became anarchy. There was no government. Everything broke down for the entire country. And pretty soon, Red Guards and rebels started to fight with each other because they all wanted to show that they were more revolutionary than the other person. So Red Guards were engaged in fightings, physical fightings, violence against each other on very large scale. And I was able to find just one photograph from the web on the right-hand side showing one of the scenes of the fightings between Red Guards. On the left-hand side is an artist's rendition of what happened after one of the fightings. Of course, many people died. Hundreds, thousands of people were killed in those fights. Mao characterized the fighting during that period of time as a full-scale civil war. Tanks were used, cannons were used. Of course, all sorts of weapons were used in this civil war during that period of time. and many, many people died. So eventually things were so out of control, even Mao thought that this shouldn't be allowed to continue. But there were so many young people, like myself, teenagers, having no schools to go to, no jobs to work on, roaming around the city, having nothing to do, looking for trouble, getting into fights everywhere. So what do you do with all these young people? And Mao came up with quite a brilliant idea. He decided to send exiling all these people to the countryside, to the most remote parts of China, to the poorest parts of China. So in 1969, Mao sent 17 million young people, teenagers, to the countryside. 17 million representing about 10% of the entire urban population of China. At the time, China's urban population was about 160 million people. In more recent years, in the past 10 years, the world has witnessed the largest urbanization process in China. Hundreds of millions of people have become urban dwellers from being peasants. And 50 years ago, it was the most massive de-urbanization process in human history. 17 million people were sent to the countryside. So I was sent to the Gobi Desert. And if you look at the map of China, whose shape is like a rooster, Beijing is at the throat of the rooster, right here. And the Gobi Desert is on the back of the rooster in yellow color. The red dotted line is the Great Wall. In ancient times, anything north of the Great Wall was considered to be inhabitable barbarian land. And the wall was built to prevent the barbarians, the Huns and the Mongols from coming into China. And that's where I was sent into the Gobi Desert together with many of my friends. And this is how the terrain looked like when I first arrived there. And that was a photograph of myself at the age of 15 when I was first sent. And this picture, of course, was taken in more recent times, but I can assure you that 50 years ago, it looked exactly the same. And we worked very hard for 6 years on this piece of land, trying to turn this into fertile farmland. And we worked under the blazing sun in summertime, extreme cold in wintertime, and we worked day in, day out, and trying to farm this land and to produce crops. And you can imagine how successful we were. Just look at the terrain, it's exactly the same. It was totally futile and totally waste of life and resources. But that's how we spent many years working on this piece of land. When we first arrived there, it was already quite cold, and winter was coming. And in the Gobi Desert, winter is extremely cold. The temperature can easily drop to minus 20 or minus 30 degrees. But we got there to find no housing. There was no housing for us. So we had to dig holes on the ground to spend the night. Extremely cold at night, shivering throughout the night. And that's what we had to do. And then eventually we built some huts, shelters for ourselves. And this photograph, well, by the way, this is another photograph of myself in the Gobi. It gives you some idea. I was chasing after a bull over there. And my publisher actually turned this photograph into the cover of the book. But they doctored the photograph and took away the cow, which I quite like. But in any case, this is the huts that we built for ourselves, and that's where we spent the winter, the first winter when we first arrived there. And the temperature inside and outside was exactly the same because there was no heating. But of course, you were protected from the strong sandstorm in the Gobi Desert at that time. The only source of heating that we had at the time was cow manure. When cow manure is dried, you can burn them, and it lasts 7-8 minutes, and it doesn't smell so bad. So we would spend hours collecting cow manure in the vast Gobi Desert in order for us to build a little bonfire at night to give us some warmth, some heat, to enable us to take off our clothes to get under the cover. Otherwise, in that kind of temperature, it's exceedingly difficult to remove even one piece of clothes because it was just too cold. So I like to tell my friends, when I first arrived in America, I noticed that when people didn't agree with each other, they like to use the expression, bullshit. And I was thinking to myself, that thing used to be so dear to me. In wintertime, in northern part of China, typically peasants would take very long holiday because the crops are in, the land is frozen, there's nothing to do in the fields, and it's too cold. So everybody would stay inside for 2 to 3 months until spring comes. We were not so lucky. We were organized like a semi-military. We had to march to orders, whatever we were told to do. So we had to march miles and miles to a frozen lake to cut reeds, which grew on the lake in summertime. So when winter comes, the lake is frozen. You can go onto the lake to cut the reeds. And we had to do this hard work every winter to cut down the reeds, to send them to a paper mill many miles away to turn them into pulps, paper pulp. And this is a photograph of myself cutting reeds on the frozen lake using this crude instrument with an iron blade in front of it. You will have to use all your bodily strength to push this thing forward. We were given a quota of 0.5 metric ton per person per day. Without finishing this quota, we would not be allowed to take a break. We couldn't go back to have the next meal. We were provided with 2 meals a day, one in the morning at 8 o'clock. There was never enough to eat. The next one would be about 4 or 4:30 in the afternoon. That was all. And we starved all the time, every day at about 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. My stomach would be completely empty and my energy would be spent. I would feel so cold. I would be shivering all the time. And yet, without finishing the job, you just couldn't stop. You would have to continue to do this. And this is another photograph of my friend, putting together the reeds and stack them up. And the hard thing was we were working on the lake. We stood on millions of gallons of water, and yet we were thirsty all the time because there was no water. We couldn't get through the ice to get to the water. So every day we had to fight with the thirst. And the only way for us to quench our thirst was to dig out some ice and suck on the ice. In deep winter, when the temperature was -20, it was exceedingly difficult to quench your thirst by sucking on ice. But that's the only source of moisture that we had. And the biggest waste, in my mind, was our life, because none of us was provided with education. For this long 10 years, we were all deprived of an education. And what I feel sad about is many of my friends are extremely talented. They could have made it in life to accomplish great things, and yet because we were not provided with schooling or education, our lives were completely wasted. In a sense, I'm a survivor of the Cultural Revolution because I didn't completely waste my time, and I was able to study and taught myself a couple of things. But most of my friends didn't do that because after a day of 12, 14 hours of hard labor, it was very difficult for anybody to pick up a book. And besides, all the books were banned in China at the time. And to be caught reading, you would get into very serious trouble. So here's a photograph of myself standing together with a friend of mine who is holding a violin. And the reason I want to show him to you is he's a very talented person, very artistic, very talented. He was able to pick up any musical instrument, and he would learn to play the musical instrument by himself after a few weeks. And he could play any musical instrument beautifully just by playing with it for a few weeks. And he got hold of a violin, and he was able to play the music very nicely. He was a painter. He was an artist to carve the seals, the chops, the Chinese seals. And he was one who took all the pictures. He had a crude camera, and he took all the pictures. He developed the films, and he printed all the pictures very often just with the candlelight. And he's that talented. And eventually, he was able to get out of the Gobi by carving the official chop on the plastic sole of his shoe. And then he stamped on a piece of paper to certify he was too sick to stay in the Gobi. And then he was released, and he was sent back to Beijing. But once he got back to Beijing, he couldn't find a job because by then the Cultural Revolution was over, and China started to move away from Mao's system of centrally planned economy into a market economy without any education, without any knowledge. It was exceedingly difficult to find a job. So to this day, almost all my friends from Gobi days live in poverty because there was never any education. So our generation can be truly described as the lost generation, just because we never were given the opportunity to receive an education. We were young, we were teenagers, and at the time, there were some older people as well, very few. And one of them was Yi Kong, standing to the left of myself. And this is a photograph of myself with him. He was the foremost aviation expert in China at that time. He was trained in the United States to fly fighters, and he was trained in the US Navy as well on battleships. And he was serving in the Air Force of the old regime, Kuomintang regime, before the People's Republic. But in 1949, he and his comrades defected from Kuomintang government to the communist side, flying 12 aircraft from Hong Kong to Beijing. So what they did really laid the foundation for Air China today. And so he made good contribution to the new country, to the new China. And yet, during the Cultural Revolution, because of his background, he was labeled by the Red Guards in his organization in China's Civil Aviation Administration as an American spy, as a counter-revolutionary. So he was exiled to the Gobi to do hard labor together with us. He was already in his late 50s. And he was the one who really told me a thing or two about the world outside of China, because he studied in America and he knew about the world outside of China. I still remember how shocked I was when he told me that America in 1940s was much richer than China in 1970s, when we were in the Gobi. And I didn't know that. I thought that China was a strong socialist country, and I was very sympathetic for all the oppressed people in capitalist societies. And after he told me about how rich America was in 1940s, I lost all my sympathy for all the oppressed people in capitalist societies. So all this came to an end in 1976 when Mao died. And 2 years later, Deng Xiaoping came back to power. He was also exiled into Jiangxi province to work as a factory worker. And I think he and his comrades reflected upon the experiences of Mao's rule and Cultural Revolution and all that, and decided to take China away from the old system under which all economic activities were controlled by the government, to move in the direction of a market economy. And the rest, is history, and everybody knows what happened to the Chinese economy. But in connection with the economic reforms, moving in the direction of the market economy, China also opened its door. In 1979, Deng Xiaoping visited America. Jimmy Carter hosted him. And in one of the meetings, Jimmy Carter brought up the subject of immigration, because there was a law at the time in the United States to tie the most favored nation status for trade with immigration policy of the trading partner. The act or a law designed to kind of encourage or punish the Soviet Union for restricting the Jewish immigration from the Soviet Union to the United States. So Jimmy Carter brought up this subject, suggesting because of China's restriction for people to come out of China, the trade relationship could not become immediately normalized. And according to Carter in his memoir, during this conversation, Deng leaned forward and said, "How many people do you need? Is 10 million enough?" And Carter immediately dropped the subject. But since that point on, China opened its door and allowed students first to go out of China to visit America and some other foreign countries. So in 1980, I had the opportunity to go to America as a visiting scholar to San Francisco. And I first arrived in San Francisco, and this is a photograph of myself on this side, smiling, with Dianne Feinstein, the US Senator representing California today, but at that time, she was the mayor of San Francisco. And she hosted a party for myself and a couple of other people traveling together with me. And a few years later, I got into the PhD program at UC Berkeley, where I received my PhD, and eventually I went on to become a professor at the Wharton School, where I taught for about 6 years. And when I was studying at UC Berkeley, my professor, or one of my professors, was Janet Yellen, who later became the chair of the Federal Reserve System. She very kindly wrote a foreword for the book. Among other things, she said he had arrived at Berkeley to start his PhD program, and I was his academic advisor. I was stunned to discover that he had no formal math training. All the math he knew, he had learned by himself, by candlelight. By then, it was too late. They didn't kick me out. I very often say that I fooled myself through the American educational system, because at that time, they knew so little about China. So they thought, since I went to America as a visiting scholar, I must have had all the credentials. They didn't know that I, in fact, had never had a secondary education. And so that basically is kind of my story, going through, getting out of the Gobi and going through the American educational system. I published this book last year, and I was told that the book is doing very well. In fact, last year it was named one of the best 10 by Financial Times, and it was also a national bestseller in the United States. I was told that the only best-selling books the best-selling books are put into Amazon's physical stores. Amazon actually has some physical stores. And somebody sent me a photograph of my book in one of the stores, like so, out of the Gobi. And when I look at this photograph, I'm not quite sure about the company I keep. Although I must say, somebody else must have had even tougher life than I did. That, ladies and gentlemen, is my story, and thank you very much. May I?